I'm ShawNshawN. I do art on eBay and also on my website, ShawNshawN.co. Today I'm going to review Vice. So Vice is all about Dick Cheney, who was the vice president under George W. Bush, the second Bush. And Christian Bale plays Dick Cheney very well, I would add. Amy Adams plays his wife, Lynn Cheney. You have Steve Carell playing Don Rumsfeld, which I thought was pretty interesting, and Sam Rockwell playing W. Bush. So this goes all the way back to when he first starts dating Lynn, and he's kind of a drunkard. He's a failed Yale dropout. Lynn gives him kind of an ultimatum. Her father was very abusive. It turns out later that maybe her father possibly killed her own mother, but there was a really bad investigation. So that was pretty interesting. I didn't know that about Dick Cheney's wife. From there it goes on to later as he kind of rises up the rank, first as intern, and he works for Don Rumsfeld under the Nixon administration, later the Ford administration. So it has kind of that nice buildup of how he kind of climbs the ladder politically. And then once Ford, after Ford, Carter wins the election, and it's this Democratic throws him out for 4 years. So then he goes to the private sector. So it shows kind of that transition to private sector. Then he gets back into power under Reagan. I think he's under Department of Defense. Then later, of course, under George W. So they have all that kind of development. So they took off a huge chunk to really take that on. That's a huge chunk of change to cover. What I thought they did well was they covered how Dick Cheney decided not to run for president after Carter, against Reagan. He didn't think he'd have a shot. He just wasn't a good speaker, public speaker. And his daughter was gay. So it was either kind of out his daughter and go through the rigmarole of that, probably lose the election anyway because he's not a popular speaker, or just be in the background, which he decided to do. So he decided to protect his daughter versus running for higher political office, which he had really wanted to do anyway. So that kind of showed some good character basis for Dick Cheney. Some of the things also what they did well is they covered kind of the shooting accident where the guy that's shot by Dick Cheney actually has to apologize to Dick Cheney. That's pretty funny. And as well as they kind of show, some of the precursor warnings of attacking Iraq. And there's this, outlaw terrorist group, and they're like, we'll get to it later. And that group ends up developing into ISIS. And then, later, of course, under the Obama administration, they pull out, and that creates a vacuum for ISIS. So there's kind of this debate whether Bush caused ISIS or Obama's power vacuum led to ISIS becoming a problem. You can debate that historically. So from that aspect, I thought it was pretty well. Some of the stuff they didn't add, which I really thought they should have, is the senior Bush president, he actually had an assassination attempt by Saddam Hussein. So that was also a motivation for George W. Bush, once he became the power, to actually go after Saddam. Besides the oil fields, there were definitely oil fields, so they covered that. And that's probably the primary connection, but the fact that he tried to kill his father, someone tries to kill my father, I'm going to take him out, especially if I'm president. So that's the only way to kill like a dictator, right? So maybe it was just a personal feud versus the oil fields. Who knows? They also did a really skimpy job on the hunt for Osama bin Laden. They kind of cover it, but not really. And I'm sure they gave a good attempt to go after Osama bin Laden. They did pull back and go into Iraq, and that was kind of a flawed aspect of the administration fighting the war in Afghanistan and Iraq at the same time versus just focusing on Osama and then come back to Iraq later if Iraq was connected, and they did cover the weapons of mass destruction. They couldn't find anything, but they kind of skimmed that over fast. They should have really showed, the vans driving around and all the kind of stuff that we saw going into the war, and they skimmed over that a little bit too fast. Again, because they covered this huge section of his life earlier for like probably half the film at least, which they probably should have just done like the first third maybe, and then the 2/3 should have been probably just the presidency. That's how I probably would have done it. Another thing is they kind of cover the torture that comes up obviously during the Bush, and they show some of the scenes, but they don't show how the administration really reacts to it. They just show like, oh, this is what happened under Bush, but they don't show how they were trying to react to that, maybe trying to cover it up. And they didn't have that famous statement, we're going to take the gloves off, which kind of led to the torture in a way. So they should have probably included that statement besides the mission accomplished, which they did throw in there. They also didn't cover some of the World Trade Center conspiracy theories. I don't think it's probably too broad to cover any of that. Why World Trade Center 3 fell when it wasn't hit by any of the airplanes, but mysteriously fell. They kind of covered the NSA expansion of powers a little bit, kind of in a joking way, but I think they should have really covered that maybe through a meeting where they meet with like AT&T, the big Sprint, all the big 3 or 4 telephone companies, and really put the under the thumb and say, hey, we're going to tap your wires I don't care about the American rights, blah, 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 blah. Something to that effect to kind of get that more clear across. Another thing they didn't even cover at all is McCain not using Bush in the follow-up to the campaign, which would have been kind of useful, I think, as maybe like where the end of the film probably should have been, maybe. And then of course Obama winning. I think that's where they should have ended the film. Instead they go on like his heart attacks, and then how this victim that became his heart donor is the storyteller, which doesn't make any sense. It was really stupid. You know, he's a heart donor, he's a heart donor. It's not like if you're on the list for waiting for heart, you're gonna get the heart. If you don't have it, you don't. You know what I mean? It's just, I think they're a little bit reaching there. They had some really kind of cheap shots too, like about like his sexual impotence. I mean, maybe that's why he went to war. I mean, he's obviously a heavyset guy. It just detracts from the story. It doesn't. Yeah, people know, you know, once they get to a certain age, especially in their 60s, this guy has heart issues. I mean, I think the heart issues are pretty clear. Heart issues, you're probably not going to have that much sex, right? So it's just, I think they just took it a little bit too far there. Yeah, they had this weird imagery in the war too, that they would just throw in weird stuff to kind of show the drama of war or something. I don't know. It just looked weird, and war's crazy enough as it is that you can use the war imagery purely. You don't really need anything else to dramatize it. They had kind of a weird version of Nixon's as well. They're kind of hokey. I don't know if they gave a really fair shake to Nixon in a way. I mean, obviously Nixon, they overstepped the power, but he also did some positive things like with China and opening up with China, so they just kind of glossed that over. It just seemed like, you know, as part of the material, they just didn't have enough material, and they admit to not having enough material. But then they kind of take kind of these cheap political shots at the character, and there's just enough flaws in Dick Cheney and as far as what they actually did that you don't need to take political cheap shots. You really want to play it straight. They didn't really do that in some of the scenes, and it came off hokey and just became kind of a political assassination thing when there's enough material that Dick Cheney kind of sinks his own ship in a way. So, you know, I don't think they really needed to do that, and it just kind of takes away from the seriousness of the film. If they would have had a much more serious approach where you don't know where they're kind of coming from, and then, you know, show some of the flaws but not in a joking way. It just came off hokey and just kind of looked like a political hit job versus, which maybe, you know, they did this so they can sway voters in the next election, obviously in 2020, but yeah, it's just a weird way to do it, I think. You know, I just haven't seen too many films like this, maybe. And they covered the end of his life, like, afterwards. It was just all in the nonsense, like, what happens to his daughters and everything. It's like, we don't really care at this point. It's nice, but it doesn't really, like, if he had died, then it would make sense, maybe, to, like, continue on. But I think they should just ended on the W presidency and then going into Obama, really there, maybe how McCain approaches him and says, hey, why don't you help me run? That would have been the best place to stop it and cover much better the 9/11 going into the war setting. I think that should have been at least one full act, and you feel like it's maybe an eighth of an act instead of a full act. So, I mean, to me, the beginning should have just been, you know, he meets his wife, early life, the second act, his political back previous, like how he meets Rumsfeld, that's really good. But then that good third of the act has to be 9/11 and World Trade Center, and that's just like tons of meat there. And it just seems, I don't know, it just didn't seem like they covered everything well. They talk about some of the 22 million emails that were hidden, but they don't show it. You know, it's like if you have visual media like film, you show it. You do not write it on the screen. Go look at the movie Wall-E. They do the whole film. It's only through visuals. That's all you need to tell a story. So you should be able to tell the story. This is just bad editing and not shooting the right scenes, not getting enough scenes, and just like, well, we'll fill it with some text. You don't want to do that, guys. It's just really bad filmmaking, I think. You know, overall, I thought it was a pretty interesting film. I'd recommend to go see it. Yeah, it's definitely a flawed film. I think they could have cut back a lot of the scenes from the film and focused more on the presidency. It would have been way more interesting. You know, they got kind of sidetracked. They didn't cover really Halliburton too much, like how he's the CEO and all that. And that's much more important versus his earlier life is important, but they're just all over the place, and they don't really cover all the aspects. They don't cover George W. Bush very well either. They kind of say he's completely sidelined, which maybe he was. I kind of find that hard to believe that he's completely sidelined. I mean, he was the governor of Texas. You know, people thought he was an idiot, but they really portray him like an idiot, and I don't know, you should just show why he's an idiot, you know, versus just assuming he's an idiot. Overall, it's a pretty good film. I'd recommend to see it. Again, it's kind of like a political hit job, so they're really killing the audience, I think, for diehard Republican voters. They're going to be like, they're not even going to see it. You know, if they had done it a little bit more objective, I think it would have got a much broader audience, and they're really sinking their sails by doing it to very rich Hollywood kind of viewpoint of politics versus having kind of a good base of Republicans and Democrats kind of pulling into this and the real Republicans and Democrats kind of going into this, it would make more sense. So they have a good story, but it's just very convoluted. There's a little bit too much stuff in there, stuff that was missing that should have been in there. So it's an imperfect story, and they did say they struggle because there's a lack of material. So, you know, maybe there'll be a biography later. They can reshoot the film in 20 years, who knows. But, you know, it's very interesting. So, but anyway, hope you guys like it. Give it a thumbs up. If you want to subscribe below. And hope to see you in the next movie review.